Welcome to the stage, Christian Echel. Mr. Echel is the head of the Asia-Pacific team at KAS. You're based in Berlin now, and you used to be in Singapore for a long time, I think for about 5 years before you left here. So welcome back to Singapore. And next to him is Dr. Yo Lei Hui, who is a senior research fellow at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, and also the European Center. You're a director of the European Center. I think Ambassador Kaushikyan has sort of, in his remarks, laid the groundwork for this part of the program, which is on Pax Americana. He seemed a bit skeptical about it. But, and he also quoted John F. Kennedy in his remarks. One of the things that Kennedy said about so-called Pax Americana is that he described it as a period of genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living. Now, there have been ups and downs, and Bilahari talked about it, that there's never really been a period of complete peace. There have been conflicts. In Asia, we had the Korean War, we had the Sino-Indian conflict, then came Vietnam, and in between, the global attention was on the Cuban Missile Crisis. But then came the Soviet collapse, and then China entered WTO, and we all thought that we were all going to now settle in for a period of calm, prosperity, and continuous growth, perhaps. But the last 15 years have been quite worrisome on many fronts, and Bilahari himself has been quite critical about China for its assertiveness, what he calls premature assertiveness. We sort of thought we could live with it, but now we have this new situation where the Americans, who were always for open trade, open markets, and underwrote global security for the rest of the world with its 11 aircraft carrier battle groups, or I don't know how many they have. But that seems to be changing now. And the champion of the free market is now run by a man who takes pride in being called tariff man. And, there is, more than anything else, there seems to be a sullenness about the United States that makes those of us who are so influenced by America in our formative years, taken aback. I mean, it's like it does not want anymore to be the shining city on the hill. So what comes next? And this is what we're going to discuss here about the so-called post-Pax Americana period. And Bilahari, do you want to put some framing thoughts for this on what this new world order is likely to be? Is the US-led order ending or merely evolving? Maybe you could frame the situation and then we'll go to the others.
First of all, the US-led order was only part of the global order for 40 over years. Right? Even those who were part of the order never agreed with all of the premises of that order. Not in Europe, not in Asia. Right? We agreed, let's say Singapore, we agreed much more with the economic premises of that order than the political premises. And we certainly disagreed with the idea that because certain values are said to be universal, that give other countries a say in how you order your internal affairs. Right? And we still disagree. In that case, in that particular idea, we are much more aligned with China or even Russia. And I think many Asian countries is a matter of degree. First point. Secondly, Pax Americana wasn't very peaceful. It's not just those big conflicts you were talking about. John F. Kennedy inauguration 1963. The 1960s, 1970s were periods of decolonization, and attendant upon decolonization were numerous conflicts in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, right? So it is a conceit of the West, because they were relatively peaceful, it doesn't mean there was a pax over the whole world. Just because we agreed with some premises of their pax, doesn't mean we agreed with every premise. You mentioned trade. Why? It is true, from the 60s through the 70s, by the 1980s, it began to war real thin. Why was America very generous in opening its markets, in allowing free trade and so on? Not because this is a natural thing of a natural part of American political culture. In fact, free trade has always been highly contentious in American political culture from the beginning of the Republic to the present day. Because it was not because of altruism, because it was a weapon in their existential struggle against the Soviet Union, to bind their allies and their friends to themselves. So I don't like what is happening. Nobody, how to like what's happening. But I don't get too excited, because if you look at it in historical perspective, it is what I call earlier a return to normalcy.
Right. Thank you. Christian, we haven't heard much about Europe this morning, and this is your opportunity. From when we look at Europe from here, we see interesting things happening there. You are going through an energy transition as you lean away from dependence on Russian energy. You're going through a defense transition because Mr. Trump is telling you it's time for you to do the job yourself. And you're going through very interesting times in technology, and for the first time, where China used to be accused of stealing European technology, now you are telling China that you want access to my market, you give me your technology. That's a tremendous shift from the way things used to be 20 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago. Could you give us a sense of what is going on the continent?
Thank you, Ravi. And maybe we heard one thing about the European Union, which is that it's only waking up to its severe problems. That was what Ambassador Kausikan has shared. So it is indeed, as you described it, a time of very deep and very fast changes that we are experiencing in the European Union. And maybe, if I may, I would start with the new German government that was elected in February and came into place in May this year. And it was clear from the get-go that there would be three fairly big and challenging issues that we have to deal with. The first one being Russia and the Ukraine, of course. I mean, you mentioned it, I lived here in Singapore until March 2022, and then I moved back to Berlin at the same time, just a few days, after the attack has started on the Ukraine, and Ukrainian families were coming in at Berlin Central Station. So, I observed the start from Singapore, and then I was in Berlin and saw the huge impact that this had on the German society and the European perspective on Russia, of course. So that's number one. Number two is, of course, Israel and Gaza. Given our historical responsibility towards Israel, this has been a very difficult situation to navigate. And we also saw under the new German Chancellor Merz that he became a little bit more cautious about how to deal with Israel. Very careful, but still there were some changes. And then thirdly, of course, the US under Donald Trump. So these were three conflicts from the get-go, three challenges that the German government had to deal with. And all of this, of course, has a European level, especially when it comes to the Green Deal, the question on climate and energy, but of course also when it comes to trade. So a lot of this is now decided at the Brussels level, on the European level. And what we see is that there was, from the get-go, a wish and an effort to bring the European Union closer together again. I think we've been driven too much by our national interests, by our bilateral relationships, and especially China, of course, knows how to deal with this, how to play with this, to focus on bilateral negotiations rather than the whole of the European Union. So for Chancellor Merz, it was very important from the get-go to strengthen the ties with France and with Poland. But if we look at these two, of course, we see already two European countries which go through very difficult domestic developments. We have a lot of changes when it comes to the French prime ministers in the last few years. And in Poland, we have also now a new president who was or is supported by PIS. So this whole approach to bring the European Union closer together, to also bring the United Kingdom in a little closer again, is something that we are still working on. But as you said, it happens under a lot of pressure, a lot of expectations. And at the same time, China is still a very relevant trade partner, a very relevant economic partner. But our companies, in particular our car companies, indeed say we need this as our training ground. We need this to understand the technological developments. So it is indeed a very challenging situation that we are facing now as the European Union, dealing with all those changes.
Mm-hmm. You briefly mentioned bringing Britain closer. Has the absence of Britain from European councils, how has it changed your thinking, and what can you do to really bring them closer?
Well, for example, when it comes to China, I think we have a slightly divided perspective within the European Union on China, and the UK has a lot of intel and a lot of knowledge on China. To me, it's quite impressive how they are building up their network of China experts, with China experts also positioned in the different embassies worldwide. So there's a lack of information, I would say, a lack of intel since the UK has left the European Union. And of course, also when it comes to discussing the security in the Indo-Pacific, for example, the UK plays a fairly relevant role in the European comparison, and so these are elements that we are lacking since the UK went out. But at the same time, I think the UK is also not too happy about how the situation has developed after the Brexit. So in that sense, I think there's some hope that we will find more common ground again.
Right. Thank you, Christian. Li Hui, could we talk a little bit about regional institutions and middle powers? You know, we in ASEAN, we have this concept of an open architecture. You know, how is all that working in practice in this region?
About ASEAN?
About ASEAN, and you know, what are middle powers in this whole changing? I mean, since the topic is post-Pax Americana, what is the role of middle powers and regional powers in this situation?
I think it's a very complex picture. I just to focus on about both the European Union and ASEAN as so-called regional organizations in this multipolar world. I think with the fragmentation we're also looking at how regional institutions themselves are also under stress.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Both the European Union and also ASEAN, we hear a lot of criticisms about their inability to act together, the lack of internal cohesion. And this is even with Brexit, that we think that after Brexit, maybe the European Union will become much more cohesive because Britain is seen as one of the more Eurosceptic and always, for instance, in the relations within EU and US, there's always this idea that UK is a problem because it has been the one objecting to the EU building up its strategic autonomy, for instance. Yeah. But yet we see even after Brexit within the EU, the fragmentation, the EU to what I see as three different camps, right? So you have one group of European leaders who believe that when they talk about strategic autonomy in the EU, they're actually really thinking more of it as an insurance against US retrenchment. They very much want the US to be part of this whole, to continue to be, in that sense, the security provider. But what they do is they want to build up the capacities to answer to the US criticisms about not being or free riding on the US coattail. So there's this group that say that we should, of course, build up certain capabilities, spend more on defense, but their thinking is that we are still very much part of this Western-dominated architecture. We want to be part, together, work closely with the US to retain such dominance in the global structure. Then you have this group that are much more thinking that, the world is moving towards a more multipolar world. So we should build up our strategic autonomy, acquire all the instruments of diplomacy and deterrence and all that, in order to become an independent pole, right? To be really an independent pole in a multipolar world. And then you have another group that are still much more thinking in terms of accepting the fact that the EU is becoming more of a middle power, right? So we, in that sense, when they talk about strategic autonomy, it's about building this, trying to make the EU become even more cohesive, and protecting what they call European sovereignty, right? The idea that EU should become even more federal, so that it can become a sort of a United States of Europe in some way, and become more federalized, and then in the process being a middle power to work more in partnership with other powers in order to retain some sort of influence in the world. So you have this fragmentation, and that's why I think the EU in that sense are also facing that problems of acting cohesively together because of three different camps of three different views.
Right.
How EU should work. Similarly, in ASEAN, I think we also have different ideas. Of course, when we talk about strategic autonomy of ASEAN countries, there are those who think more in the more sort of least, how do I put it, in a way that say we just don't want to be forced to make a choice between US and China in their strategic rivalry, right? And not to become the pawns in the big power game. But of course, there are those who are much more proactive and think that it's not just not wanting to be caught between in this rivalry, but also how to benefit from the, how to derive the most benefit or most space of maneuver, as Ambassador Bilahari said about in the competition. So again, we face very different sort of focus and interest, and I think the only way for middle power or small powers, small countries in Southeast Asia to find ways to work together is what a lot of people are saying, that there's no very tight alliance, but really going for the flexible coalitions of the willing, finding poles of interest and priorities, working around poles of interests and norms, and try to, when we talk about a multipolar world, we tend to think of poles in terms of spheres of influence and powers. But what we should do is to build poles of interest and norms, right? And I mean, this is very academic in the way, but I haven't really think much or develop it further. How do we marry the concept of multilateralism and multipolarity together to what I call a concept of multilateral polarity?
Multilateral polarity.
More poles, but so don't think of poles as only being able to be dominated by those with powers. But how do you work along coalitions, as I said, and build this as poles of interest and norms, right? In that sense, to allow some rule-based order to be...
Before I ask Ambassador Bilahari to respond to your point, this morning there's been news about AUKUS, Trump, and Trump seems to have blessed AUKUS. after the Pentagon review that was ordered by Colby. But I've heard you say that AUKUS reflects the new reality that the U.S. is no longer willing to underwrite on its own the bill of being global sheriff. I'm talking to you, Levi. Can you expand on that? And what is the alternative, and who can fill that gap? 1 second. Would you like to talk on that, Levi, before Ambassador talks about it? Yeah. It's for you. Yeah. Speak into the mic.
Sorry, your question again?
My question was on AUKUS. This morning, there is news that Trump seems to have endorsed AUKUS, which is very significant coming after the Pentagon review. Now, you have said earlier in your writings that the way the AUKUS is designed reflects the reality that the U.S. no longer wants to underwrite on its own the bill of being global sheriff. What is the alternative, and who can fill that gap? And is that a gap that needs filling, the role of a global sheriff?
Actually, I'm not sure whether I have written that about U.S. not wanting to be
Well, you
the
did.
sheriff. Yeah. But actually, I have a different reading. We talk a lot about the post-Pax Americana. What I feel is that actually under Trump, it's not that they are retrenching, but Trump wants to, somehow I feel that Trump still wants to dominate the world, but in a way that is different, right? The Washington elites that Ambassador Bilahari talked about, they try to exercise their dominance in a way by talking about rules and norms and principles. Trump just do it by pure force, right? Or coercion, if you put it this way, and not be polite about it and talk about rules and norms, but instead, when he feels like it, he said, look at the way he takes out the drug or so-called drug boats in the Caribbean. Right? So this exercising its dominance in a different way. It's not giving up its dominance, right?
Right. Bilahari.
First of all, this Pentagon review on AUKUS is a nonsense. As far as I know, there was only one important person in the Pentagon who was against AUKUS, right? And they let him have his say, and they came to a conclusion that should surprise nobody, right? I think what AUKUS, Quad, many things, other things yet to come represents is not so much an American retrenchment, but a unilateral Americans' unilateral redefinition of the terms of its engagement, right? What do I mean by that? About half a century ago, Americans decided that the game in Vietnam was not worth the candle. So they switched from an approach of direct intervention on the ground to one of acting as offshore balancer in East Asia. And they have been pretty consistent for 50 years as offshore balancer. Similarly, more recently, they thought this war in Afghanistan is unwinnable, which is true because there were no clear goals first. And both Obama and Trump tried to retrench, but there was no way to do this elegantly, so Joe Biden cut and left. But he didn't leave the Middle East. He shifted also to an offshore balancing role because the Fifth Fleet was still in Bahrain, the US Air Force was still in Qatar and UAE, just as the Seventh Fleet is in Yokosuka, and US Air Force has got bases in Japan. And sooner or later, this is going to happen in Europe. In his first campaign in 2016, Trump asked a very good question. Maybe it was by accident, but it was still a good question. He asked, why are American forces in Germany? That's a very good question. So I think it is sooner or later, US is going to shift to an offshore balancing role in Europe as well, probably out of the UK. Right? So that is not a retreat, it's just a unilateral redefinition. Unilateral is the operative word here.
Right.
Now, you mentioned the shining city on the hill just now, right?
No, earlier, yes.
Earlier, right? Just when this session began.
Yeah.
The shining city on the hill has always cast very dark shadows. This is not evident if you live on the hill, but it's quite evident if you live under the hill. Right? Unilateralism is not something that Mr. Trump invented. Richard Nixon unilaterally took the US dollar off the gold peg in 1971.
Yeah, the gold standard.
The next year, he unilaterally went to China, causing shock to Japan and other things. The Plaza Accord was another unilateral move. Big powers, major powers do act unilaterally. This is an act of life,
Right.
a fact of life, you know.
Right.
So I don't see anything unusual about this. I agree with her. Look, we all face two realities. We have to work with both the US and China. These are not alternatives. We all have concerns about the behavior of China and the behavior of the US. Not the same concerns, but they exist. So what's the logical solution to this? You work with each other more, and you're going to form, as you said, clusters of countries around issues. They are formed and reformed according to the issues, right? It's a more dynamic form of equilibrium, which is perhaps what you mean by multilateral multipolarity. Different clusters of countries working together in a multilateral way or minilateral way, and it's going to be employed. I think that's already occurring in nascent form. Trump doesn't want to have the TPP. So Japan takes the lead to form the CPTPP, and is becoming cross-regional because UK has joined, and EU is thinking about, talking about joining. And you're going to have other kinds of such coalitions, if you like.
Right. You were a bit skeptical about the Pax Americana phrase. You seem a little more positive on multipolarity, if I'm not mistaken. Can you have real multipolarity in the world without multipolarity in Asia? If you talk to the Chinese, they do not accept Japan and India as credible poles in Asia. In fact, they refer to them as incomplete powers. Can you really have multipolarity in Asia without these, all three of these getting their due? Maybe even Indonesia at some point.
Yeah, I think Asia is already a very multipolar region because it's a very diverse region. I don't take what China says about Japan and India very seriously. Neither do I take what India says about China overly seriously. I take it a bit more seriously than what China says about India. And I don't take I don't swallow whole what Japan says about China. Because what they say is conditioned by their interests and sometimes very complicated history, right? But I think Asia is already multipolarity has to be understood in a different way. It has to be understood in the context of an international agenda that is vastly wider than it was just a few years ago, right? So you're going to have different kinds of poles. It's not the traditional kind of poles which are going to be measured by military power, GDP, land area, population size. They're going to be measured by that too, but in certain other domains, they're going to be measured by competencies. Right? For example, I think if you look at the domain of logistics, Singapore is a pole, whereas it's going to be ridiculous to think of us as a pole in the more traditional sense of multipolarity.
Thank you. Look, I'm going to open this session to the floor in a few minutes, but I'm just going to ask Christian one question before I do that. As a presumed pole, what can Europe do to make itself more relevant for Asia, particularly Southeast Asia?
I can refer to a study of a very well-known Singaporean institute, the Yusof Ishak Institute for Southeast Asian Studies. They do this State of Southeast Asia survey every year, and I'm always very eager to see what comes out of it. So it's mainly about US-China. Are you leaning more towards the US? Are you leaning more towards China? And then there's, of course, the question after other important partners. And the European Union always happens to take the first place in this group of other important partners in the last 5-6 years. And what is very interesting to me is always the question, what do you like about the European Union? Why do you think the European Union is important? Versus why do you think the European Union is not a reliable partner? Mm-hmm. So when it comes to the question, why is the European Union a reliable partner? It's the rules-based order, number one. Mm-hmm. It's the economic potential, number two. And it is also the energy and climate capacity of the European Union. So these are obviously three strengths that are perceived in the region where we have to get stronger. Mm. And I would say that the second term of Ursula von der Leyen as the head of the EU Commission is much more focusing on a pragmatic approach to the partners in Southeast Asia and East Asia, Asia in general. The first trip they took to India, which I think was seen as a very positive sign there. And even if the free trade agreement with India is probably still not coming really soon. We see some progress with the FTAs with Mercosur, with Indonesia now. There are other negotiations that are on a good way. So I think to live up to this economic potential is something that is becoming more and more important for the European Union, and this is where we have to try to find our stronger footing, I would say, in the Indo-Pacific. Right. At the same time, if we're looking at what the region doesn't like so much about the European Union, it's the preaching, of course, and it's also in some cases the question of values. I do not believe so much in this question of Western values versus other values, but I think this is something that we also have to take in, as a reflection as European Union, that we shouldn't come in on the high horse, but really try to see eye to eye and
I get that, but in the opening remarks, the second speakers put security before prosperity. I found it interesting. That's not what I hear from German industry. They still value, it's the other way around. But seriously, I mean, sending a couple of frigates into these waters, is that providing security, or is that anything more than a token?
It's a bit of an open question, I'm aware of that. So frigates is one thing. What I think is more important, and it's also manageable with our capacities, is participating in exercises in India, in Australia. Again, I think this kind of personal relationship between our military practitioners is something that is valuable. Right. You're right about our dependency on the US when it comes to security. The new German government has introduced a plan to use $500 billion, euros, of course, for the next 10 years to strengthen our military. And this brings all kinds of domestic discussions in Germany. I mean, my generation, I was born in the early 80s, we benefited from this time, a very peaceful time. Hardly any of us would go to the conscription service, to the army. And this is a discussion that we now have again in the German society. Should there be a mandatory service for the army? So those are the questions that are kind of keeping us busy right now, and we are trying to step up when it comes to the security. This will take some time, decades, I would say. Right. So our relationship with the US will obviously continue to be very close, but this is what we are working on.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any questions? Because there is a microphone in the center of the room, I'm told. Khushbu. Khushbu Oli is from the Rashtriya Prajatantra Party of Nepal, which is the royalist party, if I may describe it that way. Khushbu, what is your question? Okay, while you get your mic, I'll just come to you. Let me ask Ambassador Corsican. This is a conference on political communication, and there have been very significant, swift developments that we've seen around Asia lately. You look at what happened in Sri Lanka, the change of government, then Bangladesh, then Indonesia recently, and Khushbu Ali's own nation, Nepal. We had a conference here last week where I mentioned this to Home Minister Shanmugam, Interior Minister Shanmugam, and he talked about very interesting coincidences. Maybe they were more than coincidences. Is there any lesson that we should be deriving from these sudden, unexpected, swift developments and, from a point of political communication and control?
I don't think it's a question of political communication. I think political communication is always going to be lagging behind technology, right? So, you have to find some means of control.
Right.
And that's going to be a very difficult question, because how do you balance between control and a fairly free flow of information, which you need for other reasons, among other reasons, not just reasons of values, but reasons of economic development. Right? So I don't really have an answer, but I agree with Mr. Shanmugam, may not be a total coincidence.
Right.
But anyway, I think she has a mic now.
Yeah. Khushbu, would you like to answer?
Yes, Rashtriya Prajatantra Party advocates for a system of constitutional monarchy with democracy. Okay, my question, going back to the first session, is across the world, especially Asia, we are witnessing growing political unrest and a noticeable shift in how people mobilize. In many countries, it's now Gen Z at the forefront of movements, redefining narratives, challenging traditional power of structures, and using new tools of resistance and communications, especially digital and AI. In the context of Asia's future in an increasingly fractured world, how do you see this generational shift shaping political engagement, governance, and stabilities in these regions? And how should policy makers and institutions respond to this new form of people's movement demanding fastest political change?
Thank you. Thank you, Khushbu. Christian, you witnessed a lot of color revolutions in your part of the world, and maybe this is a question you should tackle first.
Yes, happy to. I mean, amongst the audience, we have a lot of representatives from the Konrad Adenauer School for Young Politicians, which for 15 years now is trying to strengthen younger people throughout Asia to become part of the political process and to become visible. So what we see in South Asia, in Sri Lanka, in Nepal, in Bangladesh, is of course that people are taking to the streets, are protesting, and this has an immense political effect. But what we are hoping for as Konrad Adenauer Foundation is that there will be a shift in the institutional political system that allows younger people, allows women to become more active and more involved in decision-making within the parties, within the political process. So what we are hoping is that there's a certain flexibility to go away from parliaments that have 90% male members of parliament, or where the average age is 60 plus, but to have more visibility and more awareness for the needs of younger generations. Again, this is a process that will take time, but we believe it's a better way forward compared to violent protests or protests that can lead to violence.
Do you want to say something, Bilhar?
Yeah, I partly agree with you. Because you're European, because you are from this foundation, you focus on process. I would like to draw your attention to outcome. In your own country, in Bangladesh, in Indonesia recently, riots, in Philippines, and potentially in Thailand. The failure is failure of outcome, not of process. Not only of process, I should say. The fact is, failure of governance, growing inequality, slow economic growth, or economic growth that is not evenly distributed or distributed, corruption. So process is important, but outcome is more important, I think. Because if there was satisfactory outcome, young people would not be protesting on the streets.
Any other question from the floor? Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Evan. I am from Indonesia. This is the interesting discussion and also the encourage discussion to us aware of the global dynamic. So I'm going to ask, the first one I'm going to say, Indonesia reaffirms its commitment to maintaining regional stability and through an independent and active foreign policy, strengthening ASEAN central role as cornerstone of peace and cooperation, and promoting an inclusive rule-based multilateral order amid an increasingly fractured global environment. So the question in point of view, in this context, how can Indonesia and other Asian countries maintaining strategic autonomy and enhance regional cooperation without being drawn into the great power rivalry in increasing divided world? Thank you.
Li Hui, would you like to take that? You haven't spoken enough this morning, I think.
As I mentioned, I think in ASEAN we are also quite divided, and we need much more united, much more focus on what ASEAN can do together. And Indonesia is a big player, of course, but we also see that Indonesia is a bit distracted. We have a president who wants to play on a much bigger stage, and so in that sense, I think he's not putting a lot of emphasis on ASEAN. So we need Indonesia to be much more, take ASEAN also seriously, so that we can have a much more cohesive and more, as you said, work together more in order to become, to really keep the region focused on not being caught in this and playing a much more active role in deciding on our own so-called destiny.
Li Hui, I wanted to ask you this a little earlier. You know, this State of Southeast Asia report that is frequently cited, this year's report, a third of the respondents believed that ASEAN was becoming irrelevant in the new world order. Do you believe that? I mean, if you respond to that question, you know.
Yeah, actually, I think, there are two sides to this survey, right? There is, from the questions, so you see that there are actually increasing expectations from ASEAN citizens themselves that want to see ASEAN becoming, and this is a good thing, that there is that groundswell of belief that ASEAN should do more.
Right.
But of course, then they are disappointed when the expectations are not met.
Right.
And hence that response that they think that ASEAN is irrelevant. But I think we should build on this groundswell of the expectation from a lot of young Southeast Asians who expect that ASEAN should do more. And I think political leaders should take that seriously and then try and translate that to concrete, deliverable projects that matters in terms of outcome, how to create a better environment where you could have, because we are going to face a lot of challenges when it comes to the kind of economic model for development, right? With the tariffs and all that, how are we going to, and then you get high youth unemployment in the region.
Yes,
and I think these are some of the issues that...
there's also another phenomenon we didn't get enough time to discuss, and that is the semi-dumping of Chinese industrial goods in this region, which is de-industrializing. Indonesian textile industry is devastated. Thai auto industry is in terrible shape. That's another risk that we unfortunately didn't have time to respond. Bilahari, could I ask you, on Indonesia, whenever you talk about Southeast Asia, you seem more downbeat on Thailand than Indonesia. Is there a reason for that? And is there anything about Indonesia that has begun to worry you? Because I'm basically voicing my own fears when I ask you that.
Well, what worries me about Indonesia is these latest riots or demonstrations that turn into riots. It's not the fact that there are demonstrations per se. I mean, is there a day in Jakarta where there are no demonstrations, right? Every day there are demonstrations. It's why there were these demonstrations. Last year, I think, ICS did a survey about the outlook of young people in ASEAN countries. It's a separate one from the state of Southeast Asia on inequality. And it was quite clear in Indonesia, they are losing hope for themselves. Right? Will their future be better?
Right.
That worries me. Right? That worries me. It was not so some years ago, but it now worries me.
Mm-hmm. It's my duty to wrap this up, but before I do that, I've been instructed to collect a 1-minute thought from each speaker, and you're expected to say in a couple of sentences, what should policymakers or communicators in Asia focus on in this new world order? Christian, would you like to start?
So, when we are talking about how young people can be convinced that there is a bright future ahead, and that there's potential within the development of their countries, I think this really has to do with a more transparent view of what's happening in politics.
Right.
So I think what we need to get away from is the background discussions and the intransferable decisions. But I think this effort to explain what you're doing, what your strategy, what your plan is, this is becoming more and more important. And I do not see that, I would say, in all Asian countries.
Right.
So to be more open, to be reflecting more about your own politics and your political aims is very important from my point of view.
Thank you. Dr. Yo?
I would like to say that I think we need to go back to domestic politics. We tend to get very caught up in all this, international relations. But I think getting domestic politics in order, building domestic national resilience, like what ASEAN in the early days said, national resilience for regional resilience.
Right.
And I think domestic politics is something sometimes we forgot. So setting your own house in order.
Right.
And that actually brings me to the question about the U.S., which I wanted to ask Ambassador Bilahari at this stage, is that the domestic politics in the U.S. have a big impact, right? And you say that U.S. doesn't face an existential threat, but maybe U.S. does face an existential threat from internally, and that is going to have a lot of repercussions for the rest of us.
Right.
Yes.
Ambassador?
To answer your question first, I think that's a very ahistorical view. If you look at US history, you don't have to go back to the Civil War. Just go to look to the 60s and 70s, it was far worse. The level of political violence, the level of political polarization was far worse. But to answer your 1-minute question is this. I agree with both previous speakers that the key is domestic politics.
Right.
And domestic politics has two aspects, which I mentioned before, process and outcome. Process is instrumental for outcome. You can have the best, most democratic, most open and transparent process. If it doesn't produce outcomes, it's useless. Mm-hmm. The purpose of governance is to govern, and the purpose of governing is to produce good outcomes for your people.
Yeah, that's, as always. Thank you very much for that very, what shall I say, very direct remarks. And I'm sure that message is not lost on everybody here. I want to thank this fantastic panel for spending the morning here with us. I hope you folks got something out of it. I learned a lot, from this conversation, and I want to thank each one of you for making the time and for being here. And thank you very much.